Next Sunday is Mother's Day. It's not Wife Day. It's Mother's Day. Now, when you're young and you're trying to train your children to do something nice for the mom, then dads take the lead in that. But there comes a time when the kids need to do it motivated out of their own love and respect and appreciation for mom, and they give something or do something nice for her. So if your mom is still alive and still with you, show her your appreciation. I'm going to begin my lesson next week by sharing some wisdom from my mom. You know, some of those aphorisms that mom have a tendency to tell you, like don't cry over spilt milk, things like that. But the lesson is going to be on God's wisdom through mom. Tonight we're going to have a lesson on Ecclesiastes. King Solomon is the author of Ecclesiastes. He identifies himself in the first chapter as the son of David and the preacher in Jerusalem. Nobody else fits that characteristic better than Solomon. The Jews thought that Solomon wrote Song of Solomon when he was young, that he wrote Proverbs in his middle age, and that he wrote Ecclesiastes in his old age, so that he can look back on his life with the wisdom that we see reflected in Ecclesiastes. The best Christmas movie is It's a Wonderful Life. If you don't believe it is, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Wouldn't it be nice to have a perspective of what life would be like if you had never been born? Wouldn't that be an interesting perspective? In that movie, he gets that perspective. He gets to see life without him. And of course, his brother would have died. And all those people that his brother saves in World War II would have died. Now see, if you haven't seen the movie, doesn't that make you want to go watch it? In Ecclesiastes, Solomon is telling us that we need to live our lives with the end in mind. If we live our lives with the end in mind, then it will help us not misuse the middle part of our lives. And I want us to just look at chapter 2 tonight. So in verses 1 through 11, Solomon gives us the picture that pleasure, good things in life, we're not talking about sinful pleasures, just pleasures in life without the right perspective leads to emptiness. So let's read these 11 verses. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself. So he's talking to himself, okay, he's carrying on the conversation with himself. Behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. And so, here's what Solomon does, verse 4. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. And I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. And I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. And also I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. And also I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces, and I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. And then I became great and increased more than all who had preceded me in Jerusalem. And my wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from my pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. And thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted. And behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Doesn't that just make you tired reading that? In essence, Solomon said, I did everything. Solomon, maybe he was the first one that lived by the motto, you only live once. Let's live life with gusto. He tried everything. And his bottom line is, it was all empty. It's all futility. Solomon enjoyed life. Nothing wrong with enjoying life. But if that's all there is, then life is empty. Because then what? We learn from this perspective that we can enjoy the gifts that God has given to us, and Solomon will tell us in chapter 5 that you need to enjoy the labors, the fruit of your work. So it's not sinful for us to enjoy the fruit of our work. But we can't worship our pleasure. And it's one of the points that I made yesterday when I spoke at Ridge Road, is that God's plan is not to bring us financial security. God's plan is not to bring us physical comfort. God's plan is not to bring us ease in life. God's plan is to make us like His Son. That's God's plan. That's the perspective that we have to have. So I think Solomon would suggest to us that we don't build our lives on these experiences. I mean, he built, he bought, he created, he increased. Verse 10, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. If he wanted it, he bought it. If he wanted it, he built it. I mean, the palace that Solomon built had to have been gorgeous, right? He took 14 years to build his house. It had to have been beautiful. But these pleasures that we experience in life, for a lot of people, of course, those pleasures are their escape route. You know, why do so many people drink alcohol? Is because they can't deal with the pressures of life. It's an escape route. Solomon would warn, don't do that. Don't go down that path. Putting your heart into your pleasure leads to emptiness, because these physical things are just that. They're physical, they're temporary. Theodore went through this stage where he loved it when Rachel would blow bubbles, right? Every little kid loves bubbles. And they go chasing after the bubbles. And then they grab a bubble or they touch a bubble, and what happens to the bubble? Disappears. It pops. Pleasures are like that. Pleasures are temporary, and they don't give lasting fulfillment. And of course, pleasures don't get us in the right relationship with God. Pleasures don't move us into God's presence. So the first point here, Solomon would say living life for pleasures is going to leave you empty, because it doesn't prepare you for what comes next. Secondly, we see in verses 12 through 17 that achievements without the perspective of eternity is frustrating. I don't remember what motivated me to do this, but about 2 weeks ago I was fooling around with AI, and I asked, who has the most PhDs? There's a man who has 111 doctorates. That's not as impressive as it sounds. I won't go into why that's not as impressive as it sounds, but this other man has only 37, but his doctorates are more legitimate than the one with 111. But I bring that up because, so what? So what? At the end of life, what is all that education going to do for you? Listen to Solomon, verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. In other words, that is a figure of speech. It's called a merism, where you give both sides of the picture, black and white, for example. Heaven and earth. It's a merism to include everything. So when he says, I considered wisdom and folly, he means I tried it all. I pursued everything that has to do with intelligence and wisdom. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness, and the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, and yet I know that one fate befalls them both. And then I said to myself, Self, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? And so I said to myself, this too is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man, as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all who will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. Do you know, have you ever heard of the name Cornelius Vanderbilt? Do you remember why you might recognize the name? There will be a day when there's a generation of Americans, assuming the United States lasts long enough, there will be a day when a generation of Americans will not know the name Steve Jobs. So I'll mention Steve Jobs, and the audience will be like, he was well known for something, but I don't remember what. That's just the way life goes. Achievement without eternity is frustrating. Solomon here says the foolish and the wise both die alike. Steve Jobs is going to stand before God on the day of judgment just like you and I are, and his millions or billions is not going to do him a bit of good. Success in this life is not the same thing as having meaning in life. There are people in your sphere of influence who need you more than they need Steve Jobs. You are more important to people in your sphere of influence than Steve Jobs is. Of course, he's dead, but you know what my point. Because you're a child of God, you have the love of Christ in your heart, you've got God's Word in your hand, and you are more important to them than Steve Jobs. We need to work faithfully, but we don't need to work obsessively. We need to recognize that our identity comes through Jesus Christ. Our identity does not come from being productive. How do you identify yourself? I'm a lineman. I'm a teacher. I'm an accountant. I'm a Christian. How do you identify yourself? We need to look at success the way God does. We need to look at success from God's perspective. And King Solomon is trying to help us look at success from God's perspective. We've got 2 sandcastles here on the beach. One of them obviously took a great deal of time, a great deal of skill to build, and the other one did not take much time, right? The other one looks like it's just a bucket that's shaped like a castle and it got stuck upside down on a bunch of sand. When the tide comes in, what's going to happen to both of those sandcastles? They're going to be washed away. It doesn't matter how much time went into that really fancy castle. It doesn't matter how much energy went into it. It doesn't matter how much ingenuity went into it. It's going to be gone. Solomon is trying to help us understand to look at life from the end in mind. Number 3, Solomon says a legacy without control around that legacy is uncertain. Listen to his words here, verses 18 through 23. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Don't you love that? I've built up this huge business and I hate it because I've got to leave it for somebody else. And they're not going to love it. This is my baby. They're not going to love it the way I do. Verse 19. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? A fool might wind up with my business that I've spent all this time and energy and effort to build up. And yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun, and this too is vanity. And therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom and knowledge and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with him. And this too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man get in all his labor and his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous, and even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. What's the name of the guy that just stepped down from Apple? Matt Cook? No, he teaches at Freed Hardeman. Anyway, his last name's Cook, right? He's stepping down, and when I see the picture of him, I wonder how many sleepless nights he had. When you're in control of a multi-billion-dollar company, how little sleep do you get? Just wonder. I probably sleep better at night than he does. One day, somebody else is going to inherit what we leave behind. Our jobs, somebody else is going to take over where we leave behind. Our houses, somebody else is going to move in. And they may wind up tearing it down. You can spend all your time and energy and effort and money building up the house because you want it just like you want it. And I'm not saying that's bad, but the point is somebody else one day is going to move in. And they may not like it the way you do. That's just life. That's the end. We cannot control the outcome in this life because we're only here for such a little time. And so that's why we need to hold material things so loosely. When our apartment was broken into down in Montgomery back in 2006, I couldn't sleep for about 3 days. I was mad. I was aggravated. I felt violated because this is my home and somebody came into my home. And it took me 3 days before it dawned on me I needed to be thankful that Rachel and the girls weren't home when it happened. You see how I lost perspective? And it's when that moment is when it settled in my mind, the stuff that was stolen is just stuff. It's just stuff. This dear friend of mine that I've talked about from time to time, Kevin Williams, preaches, well, he doesn't now because he's losing his memory, 65 years old. He has a sensitivity to black mold spores. Not an allergy, a sensitivity. He had to move out of the house that the church owned, and this is when he quit preaching. But the doctor told his wife, you need to get rid of everything that is organic because it could hold black mold spores. There went his library that he had spent 20 years collecting. all of the pictures that Lynn had kept that their boys had drawn for them over the years? Gone. She took pictures, but she had to throw them. I had done some cross-stitchings for them over the years. She said, Paul, I'm sorry. I've got to throw them away. I said, I understand. It's stuff. We need to invest in people. People are who are important, not stuff. Having an impact on people's lives is what changes eternity, at least for them. You know what Blockbuster and Sears and Kodak all have in common? They're gone. They're gone. Every one of them had the opportunity. Blockbuster could have become the first Netflix. Sears could have become the next Walmart. Kodak could have been, what's a company that's involved in digital stuff? Anyway, Kodak is gone, practically. All these businesses are gone when they were you couldn't. My dad used to joke that they got me from Sears and Roebuck. We shop from Sears all the time. And now it's gone. Will there be a day when Apple computers are gone? May very well be. And that just suggests how temporary things are. I mean, it feels like during our lives that they're not temporary. These companies are at the top of the game. But it just illustrates how temporary life can be. Solomon is trying to help us get the right perspective in life so that we will put our energies in the right place. Number 4, life with God is the only lasting gift. Now, you and I already know that because we're Christians, but listen to Solomon. He lived before Christ comes to earth. Verse 24, there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen that it is from the hand of God. So he's not saying that work is pointless. What he's encouraging us to do is keep it in perspective. Verse 25, who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him, without God? For to a person who is good in his sight, he's given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. The only thing that really matters is our relationship with God. The only thing that really matters is our impact on other people for God. Because Christianity is all that matters, ultimately. True joy comes from God. True fulfillment comes from our relationship with Jesus Christ. The meaning that we have in life, the meaning that we find in life comes from what God gives to us. We don't create meaning for ourselves. One of the speakers yesterday, Steve Woodhouse, preaches at the Parkview Church of Christ in Warren. He used this excellent illustration. He took a $50 bill out of his wallet and he said, who would like to have this $50 bill? Obviously, everybody either raised their hand or wanted to raise their hand, but they didn't because they didn't want to look greedy. And he took that $50 bill and he wadded it up. And then he said, who would like to have this $50 bill? Well, that didn't change anybody's mind, did it? Because it's still a $50 bill. It'll still buy $47 worth of stuff. And then he balled it up again. He threw it on the ground and stepped on it. And then he held it up and said, who would like to have this $50 bill? Well, it doesn't change the value, does it? Now, after his lesson, one of the other preachers came up to me and said, we sat right behind him. He was the first one to raise his hand and said, I'll be glad you give me that $50 bill. But he told Steve, he said, I am a germaphobe, and if you had spit on it, I would not have wanted that $50 bill. His point was, we don't change our value. It doesn't matter who we are or what we've done. Jesus would die for us. We don't change our value because we're made in the image of God. Our value does not change. The value of human beings do not change. Solomon is trying to help us understand how to have the right perspective in life. So you and I need to practice gratitude, of course. We need to be thankful to God for what He has given to us. We need to enjoy life as a gift. He says here in verse 24 that life is a gift from God. Our jobs are a gift from God. The money that we earn is a gift from God. We can enjoy it. We have the right to enjoy it. But just seek God first as the source of our joy. Keep the right perspective in life so that we can enjoy life. Two men are enjoying the meal. One of them is enjoying it on a different level because he's receiving the meal with gratitude. One of the men knows that this meal comes from God. That's what Solomon is trying to help us understand. I'm bringing the lesson to a conclusion, but I wanted to bring up a few texts from the New Testament to show that Jesus teaches the same thing Solomon does. Okay, so he's bringing the lessons to us as Christians. You can turn to these verses. I'm going to tell you what they say, but and you're familiar with them, right? So in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, beginning in verse 19, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures where? In heaven, where moth and rust do not corrupt and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where is your treasure? Where is your treasure? Solomon stored up wealth and material possessions, but he called it vanity. Surely the wealthiest man who ever lived said that all of that wealth was vanity. Jesus tells us why. Because earthly treasures do not last. Make sure your bank account in heaven is strong and healthy. Evaluate where your time and your money go and prioritize eternal things over temporary things. The second text from the New Testament I want to point out is Mark chapter 8 and verse 36, where Jesus says, "What does it profit a man?" You can finish that, can't you? "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" Solomon essentially gained the world. Solomon was also at the top of his game. And Solomon said, this is all just striving after wind. It's just emptiness. So redefine success in the light of eternity. How is God looking at things? How is God looking at things? Now, don't trade spiritual health for worldly possessions. For the sake of everything that is good and holy and eternal, don't exchange spiritual success for earthly things. We have to measure life by what lasts beyond the grave, not by what we can buy with it here in this life. Luke 12, 16 through 21. Coming on the heels of somebody in Jesus' audience says, "My parents died, tell my brother to divide this inheritance with me." Jesus says, life does not consist in the abundance of one's possessions. Let me tell you a story. There was this farmer who had bumper crops. And he asked himself, what am I going to do with all these crops? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down my barns. I'm going to build bigger barns. And I'm going to say to myself, soul, you've done well. Eat and drink and be merry. And God says, you're a fool. Tonight, your soul is going to be required of you. And in the end, Jesus says, who will these things be? Now that directly parallels what Solomon just says here in Ecclesiastes 2, doesn't it? In the end, who's going to get all these bumper crops? I'm going to take your soul so that you do not have the opportunity to enjoy it. Family, we don't need to assume that we control our future. I look at my retirement account pretty frequently, Sometimes it goes up, and sometimes it goes down. Sometimes it goes up, and sometimes it goes down. And I remind myself, God is in control. God is in control. We've got to trust God to handle our future and be rich towards God. That's one text I don't have that we could have in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Paul tells Timothy, be rich in good works. You see, that's the right perspective. Prepare for eternity, not just for retirement. One last text, 2 Corinthians chapter 14, 16 through 18. Paul says, therefore we do not lose heart. Even though the outward man is decaying, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For the light, momentary affliction is producing in us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things that are visible, but the things that are invisible. Because the things that are visible are temporary. That is, they are short term. But the things that are invisible are eternal. They're permanent. Solomon looked at everything that was under the sun. He looked at the physical. But Paul says, lift up your eyes beyond the sun. Look into eternity. Anchor your perspective in eternity. R.L. Whiteside was a preacher in the Churches of Christ from the 1800s. He wrote a commentary on Romans. And in his comments on Romans chapter 8, he said, hope is the anchor of the soul into the eternal world. Don't you love that? I wish I was quotable. Hope is the anchor of the soul into the eternal world. Interpret your hardships that you experience in this life through God's eternal purpose to make you more like His Son. And keep that perspective in life. Focus on what can't be taken away. And that's, of course, your relationship with Jesus Christ. Solomon in Ecclesiastes shows the problem. The problem is life without an eternal perspective, and that is an empty life. Jesus shows us the answer. Center your life on Christ, and He will give your life full meaning and purpose. So let's start with the end in mind. Let's live life with eternity in view. And let us enjoy what God has given to us in the physical world, but especially in the spiritual world. The gifts we have in Christ. Can your church family this afternoon encourage you, pray for you, help you in any way? If we can, let us know while we stand and sing.